So, here we are. 5 years after the release of Mafia 2, a third entry into the series was announced for the PS4, Xbox One and PC. However, this time, the story and setting would remove the game from its roots, steeped in the cultural influence of gangster movies. Away from the big cities of the Northeast and Midwest of America and the Italian families vying for power there. No, this time, the story would take place in the South during the late 60s. And instead of mob bosses and family intrigue, the story would be set around a soldier coming home and punching those that betrayed him. The game starts off with a montage of various people talking about the main character in a sort of pseudo-documentary style.
This city survived the War of 1812, the Civil War, and God knows how many hurricanes. But when Lincoln Clay went after the mob, he inflicted more damage than all the wars and hurricanes combined.
This is how most of the game's story will be presented to us, as we jump between these clips of people in the future talking about his past actions, and us as Lincoln experiencing the things in the present day. We play as Lincoln Clay, soldier and part-time chiropractor who has just returned from Vietnam to the city of New Bordeaux, and is looking for some perspective in life, as he reunites with figures from his past. In our first bit of gameplay, we, alongside our friend Georgie, steal a truck and drive it through the swarms of the Bayou Phantom into the city. Our goal is to break into the National Treasury and steal everything inside its vault. In order to do that, we disguise ourselves as employees, and once we are inside the restricted area, we take out the guards. During the short dialogue in this section, we get a taste of the tone that this game is going for.
Government tells them thanks, but no thanks. That's a crock of shit if I ever heard one. Sad day when a God-fearing white man can't get a job, but ain't old nigga who staggers in his hide on the spot.
Now, as soon as you start the campaign, you are immediately hit with a warning that this game is going to contain a lot of racist language. In Mafia 3, we play as a black man in the American South during the 1960s. So of course there are going to be a lot of racial remarks, but it seems like every other word in the game is nigger. We hold off the waves of policemen storming our location until the other part of our crew manages to break through the vault's bottom and create an escape route for us. In between the parts of our heist, we see flashbacks of when Lincoln first returned from Vietnam and how this robbery came to be in the first place. When Lincoln returned, he reunited with his brother Alice and a man named Sammy, who acts like a father figure for him. After a first night of celebrating his return, he learns that they have been having trouble with the Haitians, who have been messing with them relentlessly. When we get attacked after volunteering at a soup kitchen, Lincoln decides to go and handle the problem himself. Here is where we get our first taste of what a lot of the game will consist of. Sneaking around fairly small areas, taking out enemies one by one whilst trying not to get spotted. Or just blasting our way through everybody in case we do get spotted. After killing the leader of the Haitians, we return to Sammy to inform him that we have handled the problem. He tells us that Sal Marcano has called and is demanding that we meet him at the country club. Once we get there, we are introduced to Sal Marcano, his son Georgie, and Vito Scaletta. They tell us about the plan to rob the Federal Reserve. Lincoln agrees to the job, but when they tell him that they want him to become a lieutenant under Marcano and distance himself from Sammy, he refuses. And so we find ourselves back at the heist. The boys have broken through the vault, or rather the floor of the vault, and we now have to escape in a boat race through the sewers. Once we manage to lose the cops, we are forced to sneak through a Mardi Gras parade to evade the police. Despite our best efforts, the police catch up to us, leaving us no other option than to speed into the night. We manage to lose the cops again, and we finally get to enjoy the fruits of our labor. Everybody meets up at Sammy's to celebrate, and eventually Marcano shows up to collect his share of the earnings. Everything seems great, until this happens.
Yo, what's up, Lincoln? You're possibly the baddest motherfucker I ever laid my eyes on. You shouldn't have said no.
Marcano and his crew have betrayed us. They kill Alice and Sammy, steal our money, and burn down the bar with all of us inside it. It's only through divine intervention that Lincoln survives, though the headshot leaves him in a coma for some time. When he finally awakes in the care of Father James, he swears that he will bring down Marcano and the bastards that took everything from him. This is where the real game starts. We have to fight our way through the ranks of the Marcano crime empire of New Bordeaux as we take out every lieutenant, capo, and in the end the boss himself on our path to get our revenge. To support us on this journey, we have our former brother-in-arms and CIA agent Donovan, who gathers intel on the individual key players for us to take out and who deploys a gigantic surveillance system across the entire city. To get an idea of where to start, we investigate the Haitians, who are still present in one part of the city. There we meet Cassandra, whom we rescued earlier in the story from the leader of the Haitians. She wants to take control of the city just as much as us, so we form an alliance to bring down Meccano together. Cassandra is only one of a total of 3 underbosses whom you recruit during the story, with the other ones being Burke, the drunk Irish father of one of the other guys who was also involved in the heist and was eliminated by Meccano, and Vito Scaletta, protagonist of Mafia 2 who finds himself in the crosshairs of Meccano. So from here on out we gather intel on the people involved in Meccano's operation, interrogate or eliminate their underlings to eventually draw them out of hiding and finally kill them all off one by one. And how exactly does that work? Simple. We talk to an NPC who is connected to a certain crime racket in a certain part of the city. They tell us the name of who runs that racket and what sort of activity they are involved in. There's everything from gambling to prostitution to drug trafficking. And we drive around the map completing objectives until we have done enough damage to lure out the person in question. Sometimes you have to kill everyone in a specific location, other times you have to sneak up on an informant who is protected by bodyguards, and if you alert him to your presence, he will try to flee the scene. And then there are times where you just have to destroy as much stuff as possible. Do enough damage and the person running the racket comes out of hiding to spawn at one of the locations you just raided. And I immediately have a problem with that. There have been numerous times where I have shot up an entire warehouse full of enemies, for example, done enough damage, went back to the person who informed me of the racket in the first place, only for them to tell me that the one running the racket is now at the exact location that I was just at just a second ago. And when you get there to confront them, all of the dead bodies and carnage has just suddenly disappeared. I fail to see why, in a game that has an open world as big as this one, you couldn't make it so that the racket boss has a special hideout that you can't access before doing all of the damage. Or why they couldn't make sure to at least not send you back to the very same location that you literally just came from. But I digress. Do that enough times and the game allows you to talk to Donovan about the next target in the Meccano crime family. And these fights are usually a lot more complex than your average racket boss, and in some instances, you even get to make a choice about how you want to approach them. One of the lieutenants hides out on the top floor of a hotel. So in order to get to them, you can either blast your way through the lobby or you can steal the car of one of his assistants and sneak in that way. After you kill a lieutenant or capo, you are able to assign the part of the city that they either controlled or were associated with to either Burke, Vito or Cassandra. All of them have their own benefits that you get when assigning them districts, but you have to be careful, as assigning too many districts to one person can lead to one of the other ones turning on you. You also then lose out on that person's bonus. This all sounds a lot more interesting than it is in principle. In reality, you can neatly divide the city up piece by piece and make sure you don't lose any of your allies until the end of the game. There are 9 districts to assign, and they are all conveniently placed in roughly equally sized parts of the city. I ended up giving South Downs, River Row, Downtown and the French Ward to Vito, Frisco Fields, Point Verdun and Tick for Harbor to Burke, and Barclay Mills and Delray Hollow to Cassandra. They do all have their own unique upgrades and services that they provide to you, but I honestly never really needed them anyway. This all brings me to my biggest problem with the game. The core gameplay is repetitive and not very challenging. Remember when I said that the enemy AI had been upgraded from Mafia 1 to Mafia 2? Well, they evidently decided that those enemies were far too challenging for modern gamers and gave every enemy a frontal lobotomy. All you have to do is sit behind a crate or a doorway, whistle to gain somebody's attention and stealth kill them, and the enemy will never be able to figure out how you are able to kill every one of them. When you do mess this up and get caught, you have an arsenal of weapons at your disposal to assist you in disposing of your enemies. As well as grenades, Molotov cocktails, throwing knives, a voodoo doll that attracts enemies, and later on the ability to tell a sniper to take out a specific target. Lincoln also possesses bullet time for some reason. I guess he learned that in Vietnam. You drive from group of enemies to group of enemies, take them all out until you have to drive to the next group and do it all over again, and it's boring. After a while I just started sprinting into the enemies, shotgunning everyone until everybody was dead. There were like 2 or 3 places that actually presented an interesting challenge. A research center and a construction site, but that was mainly just due to the amount of enemies. So is that all Mafia 3 has to offer? A bunch of repetitive shooting scenes interrupted by some admittedly very satisfying driving? Absolutely not. And here is where one of the most confusing parts about the game comes forth. There's a ton of interesting and fun content in the game's side missions. The stories and missions that have nothing to do with Meccano are way more enjoyable than the main story. There's a storyline about a woman who was brainwashed by an evil cult, a racist cop closing in on a wheat farm in the countryside, and a story about a former friend of Donovan who steals a nuke to destroy America. And even in the main plot, there are moments where you do get to do interesting stuff. In order to get to different members of the Marcano family, you have to sink a boat and shoot your way through it as it continues to fall apart. You have to disguise yourself as a waiter and drug every guest at a party to gain access to a private suite, and you have to register as a boxer and win a bunch of fights. The problem is that these exciting bits are buried underneath a pile of boring, repetitive open world gameplay that reminds me more of Far Cry than it does the other Mafia games. And it's a shame because the story itself isn't bad. It's not great either. The problem with the main story is that due to the way the game is structured, you don't really get to know any of the antagonists you kill during the game. Like, who the hell is this guy? Let me give you a summary of every interaction with this dude.
But that's not the only thing that
You also wait for me to kill the nigger? I will do that for you as well. I enjoy killing the niggers. You must be the nigger.
My name is Lincoln Clay, motherfucker.
Nigger? Lincoln Clay? These things mean the same thing.
And even Sal Marcano doesn't have a whole lot of defined traits beyond is racist, is evil, wants to build a casino. Lincoln is also kind of hard to buy as an underdog protagonist. The guy is built like a tank and can take down groups of enemies essentially all on his own. He does also have the tiny advantage of having a friend in the CIA who spies on the entire city for him, so he always knows his opponent's next move, and he can see through walls and slow down time. It feels like the story is in service to the gameplay. All the plot is, essentially, is just an excuse to do more of the same shooting and driving. Whereas in the previous games, the gameplay is served to create a basis for the story to take place. Which brings up an even bigger question. How exactly is this a Mafia game? Now I know it says Mafia 3 on the title screen and Vito does play an important role in the story, but aside from that, how is this game connected to the others in the franchise? Up until this point, Mafia games were linear third-person shooters that revolved around the Italian-American Mafia in some way. Mafia 3 takes place in the fictional version of New Orleans and revolves around a returning soldier getting revenge on the people who betrayed him. And instead of fighting your way through tightly scripted encounters, you now drive around an open world map, taking control of districts and repeating the same gameplay over and over and over again. I am not a big fan of this type of game design to begin with. I always prefer a smaller but more densely filled overworld, a la Yakuza, to a massive but mostly empty overworld. The story jumped the shark for me when Lincoln and Donovan drove to Tropical Island to hunt Albridge and the nuke. At that point I had to actually pause and just make sure I was actually playing the right game. Like, how do we go from this to this? Now, that is not to say that you can't take the franchise out of the big cities and into a new environment. Hell, I actually really like the aesthetic and feel of New Bordeaux. The different parts of the city feel really distinct from each other. I especially like the Bayou and Sinclair Parish as locations. Another thing that really spoke to me was the presentation of the story. Even if the characters weren't that impactful or fleshed out, the documentary style flashes into the future kept me engaged throughout the entire game. And like I said, when the game deviated from the main story path, there were some fun times to be had. But then the mechanics that were introduced during these parts just kind of went to waste once you were done with them. Like the investigation mode or the obstacles you could unlock from your car, just disappeared once you completed those missions. This is probably a limitation of the open-ended nature of the game's missions and story. When the player can complete any mission at any given time during the game, you can't introduce elements and then call back later to them, since you have no idea if the player has already been introduced to that mechanic at that particular point. Oh, by the way, in case you want to know how the story ends, here you go. You take out every member of the Marcano family and finally confront the man himself at his planned casino. First you fight your way through and confront Georgie. Or in my case, you sneak around like you're playing a Hitman game and sneakily take out all the guards one by one. And once that is done, you walk up a flight of stairs into Sal's office. A cutscene plays in which the two of you share a drink, and with the press of a button, you get to take revenge by killing Marcano. Or if you take more than 0.003 seconds like I did, Sal just shoots himself. At least I got to keep his body as a souvenir. You exit the casino and a familiar face awaits you. Leo Galante has been sent down by the Commission to handle the situation in New Bordeaux. Lincoln makes peace with him, and Leo tells us that the fate of the city now lies in our hands. Leo gets back in his car and you briefly exchange glances with the driver, who seems kind of familiar, but I can't quite put my finger on why. Now you get to make one last choice. Either you leave New Bordeaux or you can choose to stay. If you go, the city will be ruled by the underbosses whilst you run from one place to the other, always 2 steps ahead of the agents looking for you. And if you choose to stay, you can either rule the city together with all of your underbosses, or you can eliminate them. However, the latter choice results in Lincoln blowing himself up because of a car bomb that was planted there by Father James. Yes, the same guy that helped to raise Lincoln, always begged him to walk down the path of redemption and not let hate take over his heart, puts a bomb under our car. And if you choose to work together, you rule the city as one of the most powerful gangsters and expand your reach across the entire South. Like I said previously, the story jumped the shark for me when I was completing some of the side missions. So when I got to the end, it was pretty hard for me to care. And that is a real shame because the story started off really strong. The betrayal in the beginning was genuinely shocking and I was really invested. But somewhere along the repetitive gameplay loop, I kind of just stopped caring. The side missions were a double-edged sword for me, as they provided some well-needed breaks from the core gameplay, but they also introduced elements that didn't really fit into the overall narrative of the game. I think the game would have worked a lot better if they had taken a more linear approach and fleshed out the antagonists more. Instead of presenting a tight narrative that is supported by fun gameplay, it felt like the publishers just wanted to chase the current trends in the gaming industry at that time and slapped the name of a recognizable franchise with a built-in fanbase on it to guarantee a certain level of success. Then they added in characters from Mafia 2 to remind you that you are actually playing a Mafia game. If you cut out all of the unnecessary fluff and repetitive racket missions and just focused on the actual story missions, this could have been a fantastic entry into the series, maybe even on par with Mafia 2. But as it stands, it's just a mediocre open world game, and in my mind at least, the clear pick for worst game in the series. Let's see if Mafia: The Old Country can return this series to its former glory. I sure hope so.